Welcome to the deep dive. We are just super thrilled to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. It's going to be a good one.
It really is. So, I mean, you probably had a cup of coffee this morning, or if you haven't yet, you're likely calculating exactly when you can get your hands on one.
Oh, absolutely. I know I was.
Right. And usually when we talk about that morning routine, the conversation centers around this expectation of simple comfort. You wake up, you grind the beans, you pour the water, and you just feel equipped to face the day.
Yeah, it's very familiar.
Exactly. It feels entirely like your own private ritual. But today, our mission is to look past the comfort of that mug. We are going to be exploring a massive, honestly, incredibly dense analytical document that just dissects the entire global history, biology, and economy of coffee.
It really pulls no punches.
No, it doesn't. And I have to say right up front, this document shatters the illusion of the cozy morning cup. It presents an agricultural and economic landscape that is, well, it's breathtakingly complex, deeply unequal, and frankly, a bit ruthless.
Ruthless is definitely the right word for it. What makes this source material so compelling is that it completely abandons the traditional, romanticized view of coffee.
Right.
It doesn't treat coffee merely as a food or an export commodity or even a cultural beverage. It analyzes the entire trade through a highly unique conceptual framework. Basically, a theoretical avatar or like a subpersonality that the authors have named Liz.
Okay, so we definitely need to explain, Liz, because when I first started reading the sources, framing global macroeconomics around a persona called Liz felt completely jarring.
Yeah, it's a bit out there at first
It
glance.
really is. I was like, why use an avatar to explain an agricultural supply chain?
Well, it's because human brains really struggle to comprehend vast multi-century macroeconomic forces. I mean, we can't easily visualize a $249 billion global supply chain,
And
right?
it's just too big of a number.
Exactly. Or the aggregate suffering of millions of smallholder farmers, or the slow-moving violence of climate change. So the authors synthesize all those relentless appetites of the modern consumer economy into Liz.
I see.
In the context of our sources, Liz represents the ultimate archetype of glamorous dependency. She is indulgence. She embodies that manufactured desire to constantly need something.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So the document uses Liz to personify the systemic machinery of empire, labor exploitation, and, daily performance.
It is a brilliant heuristic. Instead of just giving us dry tables about export volumes, the text asks us to look at how Liz operates. It frames coffee not as a plant that nourishes us, but as a mechanism of power.
Precise.
It's comfort dressed as necessity, where your consumption is less about hydration and more about a daily performance of capability.
Yeah, and the whole goal of this deep dive is to deconstruct that performance. We want to understand coffee for what it biologically and historically actually is.
Which is a technology of alertness.
Exactly. It's a colonial commodity that fundamentally re-engineered human public life. It operates on this crazy ecological tightrope, and today it stands as perhaps the greatest masterpiece of global branding in human history.
So we want to take you on a journey. We're going to explore how your everyday morning routine is actually an ancient anti-fatigue hack that reshaped human civilization, literally fueled the expansion of empires, and is right now acting as a real-time warning system for a global climate breakdown.
And if we keep the Liz persona in mind, we start to see how perfectly coffee serves this framework.
Oh, totally.
I mean, it's naturally bitter, it's fiercely addictive, relatively expensive, and utterly dependent on an immense, invisible architecture of global labor.
And all of that just so the modern worker can feel potent and capable before an 8 a.m. meeting?
Exactly.
So we have to start with the biology. Before it becomes a brand, before it becomes an iced oat milk latte, it is a plant. Now, we all generally know that a coffee bean isn't technically a legume, it's the seed of a tropical fruit, right?
Yeah, a fleshy red or yellow fruit called a coffee cherry.
Right. But what this document breaks down about the biological differences between the species completely changes how I view that little seed.
Well, the botany really dictates the entire global economy. There are over 100 wild species of coffee out there, but two commercial giants completely dominate the global trade.
Arabica and Robusta.
Right. The first is coffee Arabica, which gives us Arabica coffee, representing about 60% of global production. And the second is coffee Canephora, which we commonly refer to as Robusta, making up most of the rest.
And the text makes it really clear that these two species are playing entirely different games.
Oh, they're fundamentally different organisms. Arabica is a tetraploid, meaning it has 44 chromosomes.
Okay.
This genetic complexity is what gives Arabica its highly prized, nuanced flavor profiles. The floral, fruity, acidic notes that specialty roasters just obsess over.
But that genetic structure comes with a massive vulnerability, doesn't it?
It does. It basically traded resilience for flavor. Robusta, on the other hand, is a diploid with 22 chromosomes. It lacks the complex sugars and lipid content of Arabica, making it taste much harsher, earthier, and, well, more bitter.
But Robusta has a secret weapon, right? The caffeine content.
Exactly. Robusta has almost double the caffeine of Arabica. And what's fascinating here is that in the wild, caffeine is not a stimulant. It is a naturally occurring pesticide.
Wait, really? A pesticide?
Yeah. It paralyzes and kills insects that try to eat the plant. So Robusta is chemically armored, it grows at lower altitudes, it tolerates heat, and it fiercely resists pests and diseases.
Wow.
Historically, it was relegated to instant coffee and cheap espresso blends. But right now, as climate stress and cost pressures rewrite the rules of global agriculture, Robusta's market share is aggressively expanding.
Okay, let's unpack this. It sounds like Arabica is the ultimate diva. Like it demands the perfect mountain dressing room, exact temperature, specific lighting. If it doesn't get it, the show is canceled. But the consumer expects the show instantly.
That's a perfect way to put it. The agronomic parameters for Arabica are incredibly strict. It evolved in the cool, shaded understory of Ethiopian highland forests.
Right.
So it demands an environment that mimics that exact evolutionary cradle. It needs specific altitudes, usually between 1,000 and 2,000 meters. It requires distinct wet and dry seasons to trigger flowering. It prefers volcanic, well-draining soil.
That's a lot of demands.
And crucially, its optimal mean annual temperature is roughly between 18 and 21 degrees Celsius.
Wait, 18 to 21 degrees, that is a 3-degree window.
Yes, and the biological consequences of leaving that window are immediate. If the temperature rises to 24 degrees Celsius or higher, the plant's physiology begins to shut down.
Exactly. What is happening inside the plant at 24 degrees?
It comes down to water preservation and photosynthesis. When it gets too hot, the plant closes its stomata. Those are the microscopic pores on its leaves to prevent moisture from evaporating.
Okay, makes sense.
But when the stomata close, the plant can no longer take in carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis just stalls. The plant literally stops generating the energy it needs to grow.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, the heat causes the coffee cherries to ripen far too quickly.
Meaning they don't have time to develop those complex sugars we were talking about.
Exactly. Fast ripening leads to hollow, underdeveloped, highly acidic, and essentially worthless beans. And chronic heat stress weakens the tree's immune system, making it highly susceptible to devastating fungi like coffee leaf rust.
Which makes Arabica an incredibly risky bet for a farmer. I mean, if I'm an agricultural worker and I'm looking at a crop that throws a physiological tantrum at 24 degrees, why wouldn't I just plant something safer?
Right.
Like if a wheat or corn farmer has a terrible drought one summer, they can adjust their strategy the very next spring. They can plant soy or sorghum. They have maneuverability.
They have seasonal agility because wheat and corn are annuals.
Hmm.
You plant the seed, you harvest a few months later, and you clear the field. Coffee is a perennial tree crop. This is the crucial mechanical difference that defines the vulnerability of the coffee farmer. From the moment a farmer puts a coffee seedling into the ground, it takes roughly 3 to 5 years before that tree produces its first commercially viable harvest.
That is half a decade of sunk costs.
Yeah. You are buying the land, paying for fertilizer, managing shade trees, pruning, weeding, and defending against pests for years before a single cherry is sold.
Unbelievable.
You are locking your capital and your labor into a multi-decade biological commitment. So, if a freak frost hits Brazil, or a sudden drought hits Colombia, or if the global price of coffee unexpectedly crashes, the farmer cannot just pivot.
They're stuck.
They are trapped by the biology of the tree. A single bad event doesn't just ruin a season. It can bankrupt a cooperative, destroy generational wealth, and entirely destabilize regional economies.
Which introduces what the document brilliantly terms the first Elysian paradox. The core friction is between the biological reality of the plant and the psychological demand of the consumer. On the consumer side, coffee is the ultimate symbol of instant gratification. You wake up, you want to be productive now. You open an app, you tap a button, and you expect a perfectly extracted, complex beverage handed to you across the counter in exactly 3 minutes. You expect the caffeine to hit your bloodstream in 15 minutes. The entire consumer experience is predicated on the word now.
But the supply side is anchored to the word years.
Yes. The cup says now, but the tree says years. The consumer is insulated in this hyper-fast, frictionless environment, while the farmer is anchored to this painfully slow, incredibly exposed, high-risk biological reality.
And that biological friction leads us to an inevitable historical question. If this plant is a biological diva, if it requires incredibly specific climates, takes years to mature, and crucially, does not offer any significant caloric value to sustain human life, why did ancient humans invest so much effort into cultivating it?
Right. It isn't wheat. You can't bake bread with it. You can't survive a winter on it. So how did this specific understory shrub from Ethiopia end up commanding the world's attention?
To understand that, we have to look at the genetics and the timeline. Modern genomic sequencing tells us that coffee arabica isn't even that old in evolutionary terms.
Really?
Yeah. It emerged from a natural cross-pollination event between two other coffee species, Coffea canephora and Coffea eugenioides, roughly 610,000 to 1 million years ago in the forests of what is now Ethiopia.
So it existed wild in the forests long before anatomically modern humans even evolved.
Long before, and early human populations in the region certainly interacted with it. There is anthropological evidence suggesting they might have chewed the leaves or crushed the berries and mixed them with animal fat to create a sort of dense, caffeinated survival ration for long journeys.
Oh, that's wild.
But the transformation of coffee from a wild botanical stimulant into a brewed hot beverage, the foundation of our modern ritual, didn't happen in Ethiopia. That innovation belongs to Yemen.
Now, anyone who has ever read the back of a coffee bag has probably heard the legend of Kaldi and the dancing goats.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
the famous story.
Right. The story where an Ethiopian goat herder notices his flock eating these bright red berries. They start literally prancing around, and so he decides to try the berries himself and discovers caffeine.
It is a wonderful, culturally sticky narrative. But our sources are careful to point out that it is almost certainly a myth, first recorded centuries after the fact by a Maronite linguist in Rome.
So it's just a fable.
Pretty much. It's a fable of discovery. The documented historical reality of how coffee became a brewed beverage is actually tied to religious devotion in the 15th century.
Right, the Sufi monasteries.
Yes, across the Red Sea from Ethiopia and the mountains of Yemen, Sufi mystic communities began cultivating the plant and roasting the seeds. The Sufis practiced dhikrs, which are intense, often nighttime devotional rituals involving repetitive prayer, chanting, and meditation aimed at achieving a state of divine ecstasy.
But human biology is fragile. People get sleepy.
They needed a biological override.
Exactly.
They discovered that if you roast, grind, and boil this seed, you create a dark, bitter liquid that fundamentally alters human stamina. They called it kawa. Yeah. They used it specifically as a sacred tool for concentration, to banish fatigue so they could remain awake and focused on God through the darkest hours of the night.
This is a massive conceptual leap. The source material points out how profound this shift is. Like, think about the history of human agriculture up to that point. We domesticated crops to stave off starvation.
Right.
We grew rice, maize, wheat, and potatoes to answer the biological cry of hunger. But coffee doesn't answer hunger. It answers exhaustion.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the shift from caloric agriculture to psychological engineering.
Wait, so we domesticated a plant specifically to hack our own biology, to force ourselves to keep performing when our bodies said stop.
Exactly. And understanding the mechanism of that hack is crucial to the Liz framework. Your brain naturally produces a neurotransmitter called adenosine. As you go through your day, burning energy, adenosine builds up in your brain. It binds to specific receptors. And when those receptors are activated, they send a signal to your nervous system saying, we have expended our resources, it is time to slow down, it is time to sleep.
It is the body's internal biological clock demanding recovery.
But the caffeine molecule happens to be structurally almost identical to the adenosine molecule. So when you drink that cup of coffee, the caffeine rushes into your brain and docks into those exact same adenosine receptors.
Oh, wow.
It fits the log perfectly, but it doesn't turn the key. It just blocks the receptor.
So the adenosine is still floating around screaming that you're tired, but the brain has effectively put its fingers in its ears.
That is the perfect analogy. Caffeine doesn't grant you extra energy. It artificially deafens your brain to its own exhaustion. You're essentially taking out a high-interest loan on your future energy reserves. You feel alert, but the fatigue debt is still accumulating.
This perfectly illustrates the document's concept of Liz and the doctrine of eat or be eaten. It frames coffee as the ultimate tool for maintaining positioning in a competitive environment. The human body naturally says, I am tired.
But the caffeinated human says, not yet.
The body says, I am finite, and coffee says, buy another hour. We domesticated a plant specifically to hack our own biology so we could keep performing long after we naturally should have stopped.
And once you successfully hacked the human need for sleep, you don't just change the individual, you change the entire architecture of human society.
That's a huge point.
If you can keep an entire population awake, focused, and chemically stimulated, you fundamentally alter how they gather, how they communicate, and what kind of public life they build.
Which takes us out of the religious sphere in Yemen and directly into the bustling cities of the Middle East and eventually Europe, the birth of the coffee house.
The coffee house was a radical new social invention. As coffee spread from Mocha in Yemen up through Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul, and then into places like London, Paris, and Vienna in the 17th century, it necessitated a new kind of physical space.
Right.
It wasn't a church, it wasn't a private home, and crucially, it was not a tavern.
The document draws a very sharp distinction between the tavern and the coffee house based entirely on the pharmacology of what was being served.
It is a chemical distinction that drove a cultural revolution. Before coffee and tea became widely available in Europe, the standard daily beverage, even for breakfast, in many cases was weak beer or wine, because water supplies were often heavily contaminated.
Gross, but yeah.
Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. It enhances GABA, a neurotransmitter that slows brain activity. A tavern loosens the tongue, lowers inhibitions, and dulls the senses. It is an environment of intoxication.
But the coffee house operates on caffeine, which blocks adenosine and stimulates the central nervous system.
Exactly. The coffee house sharpens the tongue. It heightens focus. It accelerates cognition. So the physical space of the coffee house became what the historians in the document call an engine of attention.
I love that phrase, engine of attention.
It really was.
Yeah.
You had people sitting in well-lit rooms, highly caffeinated, reading the first mass-printed newspapers, arguing over philosophy, trading stocks, and debating politics. In London, they were called penny universities, because for the price of a penny cup of coffee, you could sit and listen to the greatest scientific and literary minds of the era.
It was the literal incubator of the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and modern capitalism. The London Stock Exchange and the insurance giant Lloyd's of London both literally started as coffee houses where merchants gathered to drink coffee and calculate maritime risk.
Yeah, the impact is undeniable.
It sounds like this incredible utopian moment of intellectual awakening.
It does sound utopian, but our source material immediately forces us to look under the floorboards of that Enlightenment cafe. Because all of that wakefulness, all of that brilliant European intellectual stimulation required an astronomical volume of coffee.
And to secure that volume, European empires realized they could not rely on the monopoly held by the merchants in Yemen.
Right. For a long time, Yemen controlled the global supply. They would deliberately boil or partially roast the seeds before exporting them so that no one else could plant them.
They fiercely protected their intellectual property.
They did. But the demand in Europe was too high. So the era of botanical espionage began. The Dutch smuggled viable seeds from Yemen to their colonies in Java, which is why coffee is still sometimes called Java.
Oh, that makes sense.
The French smuggled a plant to the Caribbean. The Portuguese smuggled it to Brazil. The European empire systematically broke the Arab monopoly by transplanting this fragile Ethiopian tree to the global tropics.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We essentially outsourced our exhaustion. We wanted the Enlightenment in the cafe, but we hid the brutal physical darkness in the colonial plantations. We often talk about colonialism as a process of stealing land, but with coffee, the true violence wasn't just land theft, it was the systemic, intentional restructuring of human labor.
That is the grim, precise reality of the global coffee trade's expansion. Arabica, as we established, is immensely labor-intensive. It requires constant pruning, weeding, hand-picking of individual cherries on steep mountain slopes, and complex washing and drying processes.
And they wanted it cheap.
Exactly. To make coffee cheap enough for the working classes of London or Paris to drink daily, the empires required a massive, expendable, zero-cost workforce.
So they built the global coffee industry on the backs of stolen land and enslaved or coerced labor.
Yes. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, the brutal conditions on coffee and sugar plantations directly catalyzed the Haitian Revolution. In Brazil, the insatiable demand for coffee labor was one of the primary drivers that kept the transatlantic slave trade operating long after other nations had abolished it. Millions of enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil specifically to clear primary forests and plant coffee on the steep hillsides of the Paraíba Valley.
It is a staggering moral hypocrisy. The document uses the Liz framework to rip the veil off this contradiction. The European consumer sits in a civilized, well-lit cafe discussing the rights of man and human liberty, fueled by a chemical that sharpens their intellect. But the chemical fuel for that intellectual freedom is extracted entirely through anti-intellectual, brutal physical domination in the colonies.
And this is a core tenet of the Lizian perspective. Liz refuses innocence.
The drinker gets the alertness, the worker gets the exhaustion.
The source text points out that consumption and dominance are inextricably intertwined. The modern consumer wants the aesthetic of softness. If you walk into a high-end cafe today, you are surrounded by warm wood tones, acoustic indie music, artisanal ceramic mugs, and a barista who asks how your day is going.
Yeah, the aesthetic is designed to feel nurturing.
But the commodity chain beneath that warm aesthetic was forged in immense historical violence, and frankly, as the document points out, it is still defined by extreme economic violence today.
Which is so true. Formal legal slavery may have ended, but the absolute asymmetry of power didn't vanish. The system just put on a corporate apron, rebranded itself with earthy green logos, and developed a loyalty app.
That brings us perfectly to the modern economic architecture of coffee, or what the sources describe as the Hadbucks Empire. If we want to understand how power operates today, we have to look at the modern value chain. The global coffee market generates roughly $249 billion annually.
$250 billion.
Yes, but the foundation of this massive economic pyramid is staggering. Approximately 95% of the world's coffee farms are smaller than 5 hectares, about 12 acres.
So tiny farms.
Very tiny. We are talking about millions upon millions of smallholder farmers in places like Honduras, Ethiopia, Vietnam, and Colombia. Yet, massive transnational corporations conglomerates like Nestle, Starbucks, and JDE Peet's capture the overwhelming majority of that $249 billion.
How does the math work? If the farmer is producing the actual physical good, how does the corporation capture all the value? It feels completely disconnected from the labor.
The distortion of value comes down to a fundamental concept: who bears the risk and who captures the consumer. Let's look at how coffee is priced. A smallholder farmer does not get to set the price of their own crop based on how much it costs them to grow it.
Which is crazy to think about.
It is. Instead, the global benchmark price for Arabica coffee is determined by a financial instrument called the ICE futures market, specifically the C contract.
Okay, we need to explain this clearly because the text spends a lot of time on the futures market, and for someone outside of finance, it sounds like a completely different language. How does a futures market dictate the price of a physical bean in a farmer's hand?
Let's use an analogy. Imagine a futures market as a massive high-stakes casino where the gamblers rarely ever touch the actual chips. A futures contract is essentially a legally binding promise. It is an agreement to buy or sell a specific quantity of coffee at a specific price on a specific date in the future.
Okay, that makes sense.
Originally, in the 19th century, these contracts were invented to protect buyers and sellers from sudden price swings. It was a form of insurance.
Right, a roaster could lock in a price for December delivery so they knew exactly what their costs would be.
Exactly. But today, the vast majority of the people buying and selling these contracts on the ICE exchange are not coffee roasters or farmers. They are financial speculators, hedge funds, and algorithmic trading bots.
Wow, bots!
Yeah. They are betting on the price movements of the contracts themselves. They trade based on satellite weather data over Brazil, shifts in currency exchange rates, or rumors of supply chain bottlenecks.
So if an algorithm detects that a frost might hit a region of Brazil next week, speculators will panic buy futures contracts, driving the global price up.
Yes. And conversely, if Brazil has a massive bumper crop, speculators sell and the global price crashes. The critical issue is that the smallholder farmer in Honduras, whose harvest is completely normal, has their income entirely dictated by this volatile casino.
That's so unfair.
They sell a raw, wildly unpredictable agricultural commodity. They bear 100% of the climate risk, the fertilizer costs, the disease risk, and the labor costs.
But the corporation downstream doesn't bear those risks in the same way.
No. The corporation buys the green coffee, roasts it, puts it in a branded bag or brews it into a latte, and sells it at a fixed retail price. The corporation is no longer selling an agricultural product. They are selling a feeling. They are selling an identity, a morning routine, a status symbol, a safe place to open your laptop.
And here's the brutal economic truth. Selling feelings has a fundamentally higher profit margin than selling raw materials. The farmer sells the bean once for pennies. The brand sells the ritual, the brand loyalty, and the lifestyle every single day for $5 to $7 a cup.
And this is where the disparity becomes entrenched. The farmer is trapped in volatility, while the corporation achieves incredible margin stability through branding.
I want to push back here, though, because as a consumer, I am aware of this disparity. That is why I specifically look for the little seals on the bag: Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, organic certifications. We are told that buying ethically sourced coffee guarantees a minimum price and protects the farmer. So when we buy an ethically sourced fair trade cup, are we actually fixing the system, or is that just another layer of what Liz calls aesthetic fog?
It is a crucial question. Those certification schemes were absolutely born out of a genuine desire to correct these historical injustices. Fair trade, for example, establishes a minimum price floor to protect farmers when the sea market crashes, and it provides a social premium to be invested in the community. They've done good work.
Yeah.
But the sources are clear that they have systemic limits.
What kind of limits?
The mechanics of certification. Becoming certified is incredibly expensive and administratively burdensome. The cooperative has to pay for the audits. Furthermore, the market demand for fair trade coffee is often lower than the supply.
Oh, I see.
A cooperative might pay to certify their entire harvest, but only find buyers willing to pay the fair trade premium for 30% of it. The rest gets sold at the regular volatile market price.
So the farmer takes on the cost of proving they're ethical, but they don't necessarily get the financial reward for it.
Often, they don't. And as the document points out, at the retail level, an ethical label can sometimes function as a marketing weapon for the corporation. It becomes part of the product's mythology. Meet the farmer, hand-picked with care.
Right.
It reassures the consumer, allowing them to feel tasteful, righteous, and guilt-free, without requiring the corporation to fundamentally alter the extractive mathematics of the global supply chain.
It is a way of laundering the consumer's conscience. And the Lizian concept of the Hadbucks heiress captures the psychology of the modern consumer perfectly. The document outlines this doctrine of sip, froth, worship, repeat. And the most insidious mechanism of this is the stored value loyalty app.
The coffee shop app is an economic masterstroke. Companies like Starbucks hold billions of dollars in unredeemed cash loaded onto customer accounts. It essentially functions as an unregulated, massive digital bank.
But it's the psychology of it that the text focuses on. When you load $50 onto your coffee app, you are pre-committing to a ritual. You are transforming your future consumption into destiny. Because the money is already gone from your checking account, the next time you walk past the cafe, that $7 latte feels, well, free.
It creates a closed loop of consumption. The money is locked in, the habit is reinforced by gamified points and digital stars, and the consumer is comfortably insulated from the reality of the supply chain. The cage has a velvet lining.
We are literally paying a premium for the permission to feel capable inside the very economic system that made us exhausted in the first place. But while we are sitting in this beautifully branded digital ecosystem, the relentless corporate demand for cheap, uniform, high-volume coffee is triggering a massive crisis at the origin.
It really is.
Because this system doesn't just squeeze the farmers financially, it is actively degrading the physical planet, which brings us to the terrifying intersection of coffee and climate change.
This is where the biological fragility of the plant collides with the consequences of industrial capitalism. If we recall that Arabica shuts down at 24 degrees Celsius, the climate data provided in the report is profoundly alarming.
Yeah, the numbers are wild.
A 2026 agricultural analysis looked at the top 5 coffee-producing countries, which collectively supply about 75% of all global coffee. From 2021 to 2025, those key regions experienced an average of 57 extra days per year where the temperature exceeded 30 degrees Celsius.
57 extra days over 30 degrees? For a plant that starts dying at 24, that is not a minor stressor. That is an existential threat to the organism.
It is a physiological breaking point, and the projections are worse. Rabobank's agrifinance division projected that the total share of current Arabica growing areas classified as unsuitable for cultivation could rise from roughly 8% today to 20% by the year 2050.
So 1/5 of the world's premium coffee land will simply become too hot or too dry to sustain the crop.
Exactly. This raises an important question about climate migration.
Right, because what is the mechanism of survival for these millions of farmers? If your land is suddenly too hot, do you just rip out the trees and plant something else?
Some marginal farmers will be forced to abandon agriculture entirely, driving rural to urban migration. But the primary adaptation strategy right now is elevation. Because temperature drops as altitude increases, farmers are moving cultivation upslope. They are abandoning the exhausted, overheated lower elevations and moving higher into the mountains.
But wait, if you move higher up a tropical mountain, you aren't just moving into empty fields, you are moving into untouched high-altitude cloud forests.
Exactly. And that is the great ecological tragedy of modern coffee. In an attempt to save the crop, farmers are forced to clear-cut primary forests, destroying crucial carbon sinks and devastating local biodiversity. Coffee has effectively become a sentinel species, a warning crop.
Showing wealthy consumers that their daily luxury is directly tied to ecological breakdown.
Yeah, exactly.
And it isn't just where the plant is moving, it's how we are forcing it to grow. The document draws a very stark contrast between traditional coffee farming and modern industrial monoculture. Tell me about shade-grown versus sun-grown coffee.
Traditionally, coffee was grown in complex agroforestry systems. Because Arabica evolved in the forest understory, farmers grew it beneath the canopy of native shade trees. This system is ecologically brilliant. The shade trees provide natural leaf litter that fertilizes the soil, their roots prevent erosion on steep hillsides, and the canopy provides habitat for migrating birds which naturally control insect pests.
It is a self-sustaining biological loop.
Yes. But shade-grown coffee yields less fruit per hectare, and the cherries ripen slower. In the 1970s and 80s, facing immense pressure to increase yields and combat disease, the industry pushed to transition to sun-grown coffee. They clear-cut the shade canopies and planted newer hybrid varieties in direct sunlight, packed densely together.
But if you remove the forest canopy, you remove the natural fertilizer and the pest control.
Exactly. Sun-grown monocultures can produce massive yields, but only if they are artificially sustained by heavy applications of synthetic petroleum-based fertilizers and chemical pesticides. It strips the landscape of its biodiversity and degrades the long-term health of the soil.
And we haven't even touched on the water issue. The text gets into the mechanics of wet processing, and it is horrifying. When a farmer harvests a coffee cherry, they have to get the seed out of the fruit. In many parts of the world, they use a wet mill. Can you explain how that process actually causes environmental damage?
Certainly. To remove the seed from the fruit, the cherries are pulped and then fermented in large tanks of water to break down the sticky, sugary mucilage layer that surrounds the bean. Then, massive amounts of fresh water are used to wash the beans clean. Historically, all of that wastewater, which is highly acidic and loaded with organic sugars, was just dumped straight back into local rivers.
And the sugar acts like poison?
Not a direct poison, but it causes a biological chain reaction called eutrophication. The natural bacteria in the river gorge themselves on all that sugar from the coffee waste. As the bacteria population explodes, they consume all the dissolved oxygen in the water. The river essentially suffocates. Fish die, the ecosystem collapses, and downstream communities lose their source of clean drinking water.
It is a massive environmental toll. Now, to combat this kind of destruction, the source text discusses recent legislative interventions, specifically the European Union Deforestation Regulation, or EUDR. On the surface, this sounds like a massive win. The EU is basically saying, we will not allow any coffee to be imported into Europe unless you can definitively prove that it did not contribute to deforestation. That seems like the right move, doesn't it?
In spirit, it is a necessary intervention. The EU is using its market power to stop global deforestation. But the document points out a severe, unintended, mechanical consequence of how the law was written. The EUDR requires extreme traceability. Buyers must provide exact geolocation data, specifically polygon mapping of the exact boundaries of the plot of land where the coffee was grown.
So they need GPS coordinates for every single farm.
Yes. But remember our earlier statistic. 95% of coffee farms are smallholders. Imagine a farmer in rural Ethiopia working half a hectare of land, struggling to feed their family. They do not have smartphones with advanced GPS mapping software. They do not have the technical literacy or the capital to navigate European bureaucratic portals.
So what happens? Does the European buyer fly down and help them map the farm?
No. The European buyers, facing massive fines if they mess up the paperwork, simply take the path of least resistance. They drop the smallholders. They shift their purchasing to massive corporate-owned mega farms in Brazil that already have drones and compliance departments. So a law designed to protect the environment inadvertently threatens to cut millions of the world's most vulnerable farmers completely out of the global market.
It is always the most vulnerable links in the chain that absorb the shock. Speaking of the physical reality of coffee, what happens to all the physical waste? If we are only extracting the tiny seed from inside the cherry, that means we are throwing away a staggering amount of biological material.
It creates a shadow economy of waste. Coffee is a fruit. When you remove the two little seeds, you are leaving behind the skin, the pulp, the mucilage, the parchment, and eventually the spent grounds after brewing. Millions of tons of biomass are generated every year. Historically, this was left to rot, releasing massive amounts of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas.
So, if the coffee bean is the star of the show, the waste is like the backstage crew finally unionizing. The document highlights some fascinating, highly technical innovations trying to solve this. It discusses the push toward a circular economy, finding non-food uses for coffee waste. I was stunned by the mechanics of this. How exactly does yesterday's latte become today's biofuel or face scrub?
The chemistry is quite elegant. Spent coffee grounds are rich in lipids or natural oils. Scientists have developed processes using solvents to extract those liquids, which can then undergo transesterification, a chemical reaction that converts the oils into biodiesel, which can literally power the delivery trucks transporting the coffee.
That is incredible, and they also mention biochar.
Yes. The dry, woody husks left over from milling of beans can be converted into biochar through a process called pyrolysis. You heat the husks to extremely high temperatures in an oxygen-free environment. Instead of burning to ash, the biomass carbonizes into a highly porous, stable form of carbon. When you mix biochar back into the soil, it acts like a sponge, retaining water and fertilizer, while simultaneously locking carbon in the ground for centuries.
There are also cosmetic applications because coffee is so rich in antioxidants, and they are even using sterilized grounds as a substrate to grow gourmet mushrooms. It perfectly aligns with Liz's rule of sustainable dominance. If you eat everything, you ruin the feast. If a system consumes relentlessly without managing its own waste, it will eventually collapse under its own excess. You have to find a way to metabolize the waste.
But the text offers a sobering caveat. These bio-innovations are brilliant, but they are largely operating at a laboratory or niche commercial scale. The sheer volume of waste generated by the global coffee machine is so immense that these small-scale circular initiatives are currently struggling to make a systemic dent.
Okay, let's take a breath and summarize the sheer scale of what we are looking at. We have a crop, Arabica, that is biologically fragile and incredibly difficult to cultivate. We have a historical foundation built on colonial theft and brutal, coerced labor. We have a modern economic structure that uses financial instruments like futures markets to trap smallholders in volatility while enriching megabrands. And we have a supply chain that is actively threatened by and contributing to ecological collapse. If you look at it objectively, coffee is an absolute nightmare of an agricultural product. So why do we hold on to it so fiercely? Why haven't we just walked away from it?
Because ultimately, the transaction isn't about the drink. It is about psychology. It is about who we believe we are when we drink it.
The cultivated bitterness of modern identity. The sources delve into the evolutionary biology of taste, and this is fascinating. Human beings are not naturally born craving bitter flavors. In nature, bitterness is an evolutionary warning sign. It usually signals the presence of toxic alkaloids. A bitter plant is a plant trying to tell you, do not eat me, I will poison you.
Exactly. Our evolutionary hardware is programmed to reject bitterness. We had to systematically train humanity to override that biological disgust
How did we do that?
by tying the consumption of the bitter liquid to immense social and economic rewards. We framed coffee as an adult beverage. We framed it as the taste of sophistication, discipline, and productivity. Overcoming your natural aversion to bitterness became a rite of passage into the working world.
It is a memory food. It acts as a class marker and a social timekeeper that structures our entire reality. Think about it. A coffee in the morning signals the brain to begin. A coffee at midday means continue. A coffee in the late afternoon means recover momentum. It is literally a clock that you drink.
And beyond pacing our days, it serves as a subtle but powerful class marker. The document predicts a very specific, fragmented future for coffee. We are not moving toward a world without coffee. We are moving toward a bifurcated world. As climate change ravages the bean belt, true high-altitude Arabica will become increasingly scarce and expensive. It will become a luxury good for the elite, who will sit in tasting rooms discussing terroir, fermentation methods, and the specific hillside where the bean was grown.
Like fine wine.
Exactly. Meanwhile, for the masses, the future is premium Robusta or perhaps even synthetic lab-grown coffee.
Right.
Companies are already reverse engineering the molecular structure of coffee to produce a caffeinated, coffee-flavored liquid without ever planting a seed in the ground. The function, the chemical stimulation, will be preserved for the workforce, but the agricultural romance will be stripped away.
Because at its core, coffee is the socially acceptable drug of modern capitalism. We literally joke about our dependency. People wear shirts that say, "Don't talk to me before I've had my coffee," or "Powered by caffeine and anxiety." We joke about it because the addition serves the economic engine. Society applauds this specific dependency because it keeps people functional, compliant, and productive within an intensely demanding, exhausting system.
It is the only psychoactive substance that is actively encouraged by your employer. They provide it for free in the break room because it increases your output.
So what does this all mean for the listener? If you are sitting there listening to this, holding a drive-through iced coffee or brewing a pour-over in your kitchen, are we saying you should feel guilty? Are you individually complicit in centuries of empire and ecological destruction just by ordering a latte on a Tuesday morning?
The sources emphasize that individual guilt is entirely the wrong takeaway. Guilt is paralyzing. Awareness is the goal. Let's return to the Liz concept one last time. Coffee is the queen bee of global crops. It does not exist to feed the world. It exists to command the world to stay awake. It allows people to perform their identity. Whether you are the stoic black coffee ascetic proving your discipline, or the sweet latte comfort seeker buying a small, heavily syruped moment of joy in a stressful day, you are participating in a performance. The point of this deep dive is simply to recognize the performance and to acknowledge the immense, complex, and often painful architecture of human labor and biological manipulation that makes your cup possible.
It is genuinely marvel-inducing when you step back and look at the whole picture. A tiny, fussy, genetically fragile seed from an Ethiopian understory forest managed to tether Sufi mystics, colonial navies, Wall Street algorithmic traders, and your local barista into one unbroken, highly caffeinated chain.
It is the ultimate chain of glamorous dependency.
So let's recap this incredible journey we've taken today. We started by examining the strict biological demands of the Arabica tree, understanding the mechanical tension between a plant that takes years to grow and a consumer who demands instant gratification. We traced its origins, exploring how humans discovered caffeine's ability to block our brain's sleep receptors, allowing us to hack our own fatigue. We saw how coffee houses served as the caffeinated engines of the Enlightenment, while relying on the brutal expansion of colonial plantation slavery to secure their supply. We broke down the wildly unequal economics of the modern ICE futures market, where smallholders sell risky raw materials while corporations sell high-margin feelings. And we confronted the stark physical realities of a changing climate and the desperate attempts to circularize the massive waste generated by the industry.
Through all of these eras and crises, coffee has remained resilient because it is a masterpiece of branding. It continually manages to turn bitterness into sophistication, exhaustion into profitable performance, and chemical dependency into a comforting daily ritual.
So the next time you hold that warm, familiar cup, remember that you are not just holding a simple morning beverage. You are holding a piece of evolutionary magic. You are holding a profound symbol of human endurance and a mirror that reflects the immense, hidden complexities of the global economy. It is a murky, complicated reflection, but it is undeniably fascinating.
Which leaves us with one final structural thought to ponder long after this deep dive ends. If coffee is essentially a technology of alertness, a tool that allows us to chemically borrow energy from our own future to fuel our productivity today, what happens to modern civilization if the well runs dry? We have built an entire global society predicated on infinite economic growth and constant, unyielding wakefulness. If climate change forces the global coffee tap to close,
Do we finally have to learn how to rest?